In the annals of modern history, few individuals cast a shadow as long as Steve Jobs. He was a visionary, a tyrant, a genius, and a salesman. He was a man who famously said, "It's better to be a pirate than to join the Navy." But a pirate needs a crew, not just any crew, but the best, A players, as he called them. In 2004, Steve Jobs was on top of the world. His company Apple had been pulled back from the very brink of bankruptcy, and it had done so on the back of a single, iconic product, the iPod. The iPod was more than a gadget. It was a cultural phenomenon. It had single-handedly resurrected Apple and redefined the entire music industry. It had put 1,000 songs in your pocket. Apple was, for the first time in its history, the undisputed king of a new market, a market it had created. But Steve Jobs was not celebrating. He was, in fact, terrified. Because Jobs, a master of seeing the next move, saw an existential threat on the horizon. A single device that, if created correctly, wouldn't just compete with the iPod, it would annihilate it. And that device was the cell phone. This is not the story of the iPhone you think you know. This is not just a tale of innovation. It is a tale of secrecy, of betrayal, and of internal war. It is the story of an impossible challenge, a project so secret it tore Apple apart from the inside. And it is the story of why Steve Jobs had to break all of his own rules to illegally hire the one brilliant engineer he knew could save his company. This is the tale of Project Purple and the man at its center. Part 1. The Coming Storm. To understand the scale of the problem, we must first understand the world of 2004. The cell phone market was a fractured, disjointed landscape. It was dominated by giants: Nokia in Europe, Motorola in America, BlackBerry in the corporate world. These devices were functional, but they were not beautiful. They were plastic. They had tiny, low-resolution screens. They had physical buttons that were a nightmare to type on. And their software was an abomination. Getting on the internet was a painful, slow experience known as WAP. It was a stripped-down, text-only version of the web. Downloading a ringtone felt like a major technical achievement. These were not smart devices. They were phones. These companies, however, were beginning to see the potential. They were starting to add tiny, grainy cameras to their phones. And, to Steve Jobs' horror, they were adding music players. The Motorola Rocker was the first warning shot. It was a disastrous partnership between Apple and Motorola, a phone that awkwardly grafted Apple's iTunes software onto a mediocre Motorola body. It was clumsy, crippled, and limited to just 100 songs. Jobs himself would publicly ridicule it on stage, even as he was forced to introduce it. But the Rocker, for all its failures, represented a terrifying truth. The convergence was coming. Jobs knew with absolute gut-wrenching certainty that one day, one of these companies would get it right. They would figure out how to put a decent music player, a decent camera, and a decent phone into one device. And on that day, no one would ever need to buy a separate iPod again. Apple's entire $10 billion business, the company's very lifeline, would vanish. Jobs went to his board. He went to his top executives. He told them, "We have to do it. We have to build the phone. We have to cannibalize our own golden goose." The executives were skeptical. Apple knew nothing about cellular radios, nothing about carrier networks, nothing about the brutal, cutthroat telecom industry. It was a market defended by unmovable giants. To enter it was suicide. But Jobs was resolute. He knew what he wanted. He wanted a device that was more than a phone. He wanted a computer. He wanted to take the entire operating system of a Mac OS X, and shrink it down to fit in your pocket. He wanted a single, perfect piece of glass. No buttons, no stylus. An internet that was not a mobile internet, but the real internet. He went to his teams. He asked them, "Can we do this?" The answer was a resounding no. It was impossible. A desktop operating system with its file systems and complex processes required a powerful processor. It required hundreds of megabytes, even gigabytes of memory. A chip like that, they said, would drain a phone battery in 20 minutes. It would run so hot it would melt the plastic casing. The challenge seemed insurmountable. But Steve Jobs did not deal in impossible. He dealt in will, and he knew he would need a general for this war. Part 2. The Civil War. Steve Jobs was a man who believed in internal competition. He believed that pressure and conflict created diamonds. So, in 2005, he set up a bake-off, a secret internal war. He greenlit 2 competing projects. The first was Project One, or P1. It was led by the father of the iPod, Tony Fadell. Fadell was a hardware genius. He was practical. He was logical. His solution was the sensible one. His team would take the iPod and add a phone to it. The interface would be controlled by the device's most famous feature, the click wheel. It was an iPod that could make calls. It was the logical next step. But Jobs had a second, far more radical project, Project 2, or P2. This was the impossible project, the one based on a single, magical piece of glass, the one that required shrinking a desktop operating system. And for this, he needed a software visionary. He needed a man who understood not just code, but magic. He knew exactly who it had to be. His name was Scott Forstall. Forstall was, in many ways, the quintessential Apple prodigy. He was a brilliant software designer from Stanford. He had not joined Apple, but had joined Next, the company Steve Jobs founded in his wilderness years, after he was famously fired from his own creation. When Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, he brought his Next Step operating system with him. This system would become the foundation for Mac OS X, and the small team of engineers who built it, including Forstall, would become Jobs' new inner circle. Forstall was a rising star. He was young, charismatic, and deeply technical. He was one of the key architects of the Aqua interface, the beautiful, water-like visual design of Mac OS X that stunned the world in 2000. More importantly, Forstall got Jobs. He understood Jobs' relentless demand for perfection, for software that didn't just work, but felt alive. Software that you wanted to lick, as Jobs would say. Jobs had seen a glimmer of the future. A small skunkworks team at Apple, led by a man named Boz Ording, had developed a prototype for a multi-touch screen. It was not for a phone, it was for a tablet. The demo was a revelation. You could pinch to zoom. You could flick to scroll. It was magic. Jobs saw this, and his path became clear. The P1 iPod phone was dead. The click wheel was the past. The future was glass. And the man he would trust to build the soul of this new machine was Scott Forstall. By 2005, Forstall was a senior vice president in charge of all Mac OS X software. He had one of the most important and most demanding jobs at Apple. He was responsible for the next major public release, Leopard. And Steve Jobs was about to make his life a living hell. Part 3. The Illegal Hiring. The project was officially codenamed Project Purple. Jobs knew that to build this phone, he could not do it in the open. He couldn't post job listings. He couldn't send out company-wide memos. The risk of leaks was too great. But more than that, he knew that the bureaucracy of his own company would kill the project. If he told the head of the Mac division, he would fight to protect his resources. If he told the head of the iPod division, Tony Fadell, he would see it as a threat. So Jobs decided to do something unprecedented. He decided to create a pirate ship inside Apple, a secret company within a company. And to staff this pirate ship, he would steal his own best employees. This was the illegal act. In a normal corporation, a manager cannot simply take an engineer from another division. There are processes, there are transfer requests, there are reviews. A manager's job is to protect their team, to nurture their talent. Steve Jobs bypassed all of it. Jobs had pulled Forstall aside. "I want you to lead the software for Project Purple," he said. "You can't hire anyone from outside the company. But you can have anyone you want inside the company. Anyone." Forstall was now the lead recruiter for the most secret project on Earth. He became a ghost inside his own company. He would walk the halls of Apple, find an engineer he respected, a rock star, and take them for a walk. He couldn't even take them to his office. He would walk them out to the courtyard. And then he would give them the pitch. "I have a new project," he would say. "It's top secret. I can't even tell you what it is." He would pause, letting the gravity of the secrecy sink in. "I can't tell you what you will be working on, but I can tell you this. If you accept, you will be working harder than you have ever worked in your life. You will be giving up your nights. You will be giving up your weekends for years. You will be under a pressure you cannot possibly imagine." Another pause. "But when we are done, you will be working on the most important project of your career, a project that will change everything." This was the Jobs pitch, delivered by his most trusted lieutenant. It was an offer of immense, terrible sacrifice, wrapped in the promise of glory. Almost no one said no. The engineer would accept, and Forstall would say, "Good, you start Monday. You cannot tell anyone, not your wife, not your family, and you cannot tell your current manager. You will just not go back to your old desk. Imagine this. Imagine being a mid-level manager at Apple. Your best engineer, your star performer, simply vanishes. You call their desk, no answer. You email them, no reply. You go to HR, and HR tells you, "We cannot discuss that. That employee is no longer in your division." You go to your own boss, and your boss says, "Stay away from it. It's a jobs project." Morale in the Mac division plummeted. Managers were furious. They felt betrayed. Their carefully planned roadmaps were in tatters. Their best talent had been illegally poached by their own CEO and his chosen engineer. And this betrayal went all the way to the top, because the project Scott Forstall was poaching from was Mac OS X Leopard, the very project he himself was supposed to leading. Apple's entire public-facing software division was being secretly gutted to feed the Purple project. The Leopard project, predictably, began to collapse. Deadlines were missed. Features were cut. The developer community was furious. Apple was eventually forced to issue a public statement, a humiliating admission, that Leopard would be delayed, citing the need to pull resources for the upcoming iPhone. It was the first and only time the secret was even acknowledged. It was a civil war, and Forstall and Jobs were winning, at the expense of their own empire. Part 4. The Purple Dorm. Forstall and his new, illegally hired team were given a building, or rather, a floor in a building on the Apple campus. They called it the Purple Dorm. The security was beyond anything Apple had ever done. It was a lockdown. There were badge readers on the main door, then another badge reader on the next door. To get into the actual Purple Wing, you had to badge in 4 times. The first rule of Project Purple was, you do not talk about Project Purple. The building was locked down. The windows were blacked out. Cameras were everywhere. Even the janitorial staff was not allowed inside. The team members themselves, who were working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, would have to take out their own trash. One engineer said the place smelled like a dorm room. It smelled of stale pizza, Red Bull, coffee, and sweat. It was a pressure cooker of secrecy and impossible deadlines. And inside this sealed tomb, the impossible work began. The teams were segregated. The hardware team, led by Tony Fadell, who had been reassigned to build the P2 hardware, was not allowed to see the software. The software team, led by Scott Forstall, was not allowed to see the hardware. Forstall's team worked on cobbled-together test boards nicknamed Frankenmacs, a large circuit board with a processor and a small attached screen to simulate the phone. And at the heart of it all was the central, impossible question: how to get Mac OS X onto a phone. It was a nightmare. Mac OS X at the time was a beast. It was designed for powerful G4 and G5 processors. It expected to have billions of bytes of memory. It was over a gigabyte in size. The prototype phone chip, a low-power ARM processor from Samsung, was laughably weak by comparison. The amount of available RAM was minuscule. Forstall's task was twofold. First, his team had to shrink the OS. This was a brutal, thankless, deeply technical task. They had to rip out tens of thousands of unnecessary components. They had to rewrite the kernel, the very core of the system, to be hyper-efficient. They had to create a new core animation layer that could provide smooth 60 frame per second graphics on a chip that was never designed for it. But the second task was even harder. It was the magic. Jobs didn't just want a small computer. He wanted a new interface, multi-touch. His directive to Forstall was simple. It needs to work like this. And he would wave his hands, pinching, swiping. Forstall's team had to invent this new language from scratch. They had to write the algorithms that could distinguish a swipe from a tap, a pinch from a pan. They had to invent inertial scrolling. When you flick a list, it doesn't just move, it has momentum, it has physics. It gently slows down, and it bounces at the end, the rubber banding effect. This bounce effect alone took weeks of obsessive tuning. It was an argument. Was it realistic? Jobs loved it. He said it made the interface feel elastic and playful. They had to create the snapback. When you drag an icon and you let go, it doesn't just stay where you left it. It snaps perfectly into the grid. These were the details, the magic, and they were all Scott Forstall's responsibility. For 2.5 years, this team lived in the Purple Dorm. They worked under a level of pressure that almost broke them. There is a story that Forstall, who was working 18-hour days, 7 days a week, would come home, see his young daughter for a few minutes, and then go to his home office to keep working. One night, his daughter, who missed him, kept trying to come into his office. He kept locking the door. Part 5. The Impossible Deal. While Forstall's team was locked in the Purple Dorm, Steve Jobs was fighting a different kind of war, a war of diplomacy. To sell a phone, you needed a carrier, and in 2005, the carriers were kings. They were the true gatekeepers of the industry. They decided what phones were sold. They dictated the hardware. They forced manufacturers to put their logos on the phones. They controlled the software, loading it with their own buggy, terrible applications that you could not delete. And they controlled the money. Jobs knew that to build his phone, he would have to break their kingdom. He began a series of top-secret meetings. He courted Verizon. He courted T-Mobile. But his main target was Singular, which would soon become AT&T. He went to the CEO, Stan Sigman, and he made a list of demands so audacious, the Singular executives thought he was a lunatic. Demand number 1, no carrier logo on the phone. It would be an Apple product, and Apple's alone. Demand number 2, total control over the software. No Singular apps, no carrier meddling. Demand number 3, total control over sales and marketing. Apple would sell the phone in its own stores on its own terms. And finally, the demand that almost ended the meeting. Demand number 4. Apple wanted a cut of the monthly subscription fee. This was unheard of. It was heresy. It was as if a wheat farmer demanded a percentage of every loaf of bread the baker ever sold. The Singular team, according to reports, just laughed. But Singular had a problem. They were falling behind Verizon. Verizon had the cool phones like the Motorola Razr. Singular had nothing. They were desperate. So Jobs, the master salesman, showed them the magic. In a locked-down Singular boardroom, he pulled out the Franken Mac prototype. He showed them what Forstall's team was building. He showed them the multi-touch screen. He showed them pinch to zoom. He showed them the real internet. The Singular executives were stunned. They had never seen anything like it. Jobs had them. He was offering them a 5-year exclusive deal for the future. After months of brutal, secret negotiations, Singular agreed. They signed a deal in total secrecy, giving Steve Jobs everything he had asked for. But this victory came at a terrible price. Apple now had a partner, which meant for the first time, they had a deadline. Steve Jobs had booked the stage at Macworld 2007. He was going to announce the phone, whether it was ready or not. Part 6. The Crucible. The project was careening towards disaster. The hardware was a nightmare. The custom radio, the part that made it a phone, would constantly drop calls. The antenna design was a disaster. The proximity sensor, the tiny sensor that was supposed to turn the screen off when you held it to your face, simply didn't work. This meant that during a call, your cheek would face dial numbers or hang up the call. It was a fatal flaw. But the biggest hardware crisis came from Jobs himself. The prototype had a plastic screen, just like an iPod. One day, Jobs was carrying it in his pocket with his keys. He pulled it out, and the screen was covered in scratches. He stormed into a meeting. He held up the prototype. "I will not sell a product that scratches," he declared. "I want a glass screen." His team was horrified. Glass at that thickness shattered when dropped. But Jobs didn't care. He called the CEO of Corning Glass, Wendell Weeks. He told Weeks about an old, forgotten technology from the 1960s, Gorilla Glass, a chemically strengthened glass that was, in theory, unscratchable. Corning wasn't even making it. Jobs told Weeks, "I want a train car load of this in 6 months." Weeks replied, We don't know how to make it in that quantity. It's an unmanufacturable product." Jobs said simply, "Don't be afraid. You can do it." Corning, in a miracle of engineering, reinvented their entire manufacturing process. 6 months later, the glass arrived. But as the hardware was being reinvented, the software was dying. As the Macworld deadline approached, the phone was a catastrophic failure. It was riddled with bugs. It crashed. It froze. The Wi-Fi driver was unstable. The apps, which Forstall's team was frantically building, were riddled with bugs. The phone could not run for more than 30 minutes without a kernel panic, a total system crash. It could not play a full song without crashing. It could not send an email and then browse the web without running out of memory and crashing. It was impossible. Scott Forstall and his team of illegally hired engineers had to find a way. They were facing humiliation, not just for them, but for their leader, Steve Jobs. With only weeks to go, they realized the truth. They could not fix the phone in time for the demo. So, they would have to fake it. They began to create what they called the golden path. They analyzed Jobs' demo script. They knew exactly what he was going to do, in what exact order. He would play a song. Then he would stop and show a photo. Then he would stop and make a phone call. The engineers programmed the demo phones to only work in that exact sequence. If Jobs varied, even slightly, if he checked his email before playing a song, the phone would crash. They fixed the Wi-Fi. How? By coding the phone to only work with the specific Wi-Fi access points on stage and faking the full bars icon on the screen. The icon was a lie. The radio, the part that made it a phone, was still a disaster. It dropped calls constantly. So they brought in a portable cell tower from AT&T and programmed the demo unit to communicate only with that tower, ensuring a perfect signal. The phone was a house of cards, a technical illusion. The night before the demo, the team was in a state of panic. Jobs had been practicing, and the phone was still crashing. He had 5 different demo units on the podium, and he would have to secretly switch between them when one inevitably ran out of memory. This was it. The illegal project, the years of stolen nights, the destroyed morale. The brilliant engineer Scott Forstall and his hand-picked team had built a beautiful lie. And now their CEO was about to present it to the entire world. Part 7. The Golden Path. Steve Jobs walked onto the stage. He was wearing his iconic black mock turtleneck and blue jeans. "This is a day," he said, "I've been looking forward to for 2.5 years. Every once in a while, a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything." In the audience, in the first 5 rows, sat Scott Forstall and the Project Purple team. They had not slept. They were, according to engineer Andy Grignon, drunk. They had brought a flask of scotch with them. They had decided that for every segment of the demo that worked, they would take a drink. They expected to be sober. They were watching their leader, on stage, about to demonstrate a product that they knew did not work. Jobs began. "Today, we are introducing 3 revolutionary products. The first is a widescreen iPod with touch controls. The second is a revolutionary mobile phone. And the third is a breakthrough internet communications device." An iPod, a phone, an internet communicator. He repeated it. The audience was confused. "Are you getting it?" he smiled. "These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device, and we are calling it iPhone." The crowd erupts. Backstage and in the front rows, the team held its breath. Jobs began the demo. He walked the golden path. He showed the music player. "To scroll through my artists, I just put my finger on and scroll." He played a song. It worked. In the audience, the team takes a drink. He showed the photos. And to zoom in, we just pinch. The audience gasped. It was the first time the public had ever seen pinch to zoom. It was magic. It worked. The team takes another drink. He showed the phone call. He called Johnny Ive, Apple's design chief, who was sitting in the audience. The call went through. It worked. He browsed the real internet. He famously called a Starbucks and ordered 4,000 lattes to go. The call worked. The internet worked. For 90 minutes, Steve Jobs walked the tightrope. He never deviated. He hit every mark. He switched phones when one was low on memory. And the phone, the impossible, broken, fragile house of cards, held together. It was the single greatest product demonstration in history. When the demo was over, the world was never the same. In Finland, Nokia's engineers watching a webcast were stunned. They thought it was a fake. It was impossible. In Canada, the co-CEO of BlackBerry, Jim Balsillie, could not believe it. "It's impossible," he said. "The battery life will be terrible." In a Google office, the Android team, they literally stopped what they were doing. They knew the phone they were building was now obsolete. They redesigned their entire operating system from scratch. The iPhone was a revolution, and it was born from an illegal act. So we go back to the original question. Why? Why did Steve Jobs have to illegally hire his own engineers? Why did he have to betray his managers, create a secret dorm, and plunge his company into a civil war? The answer is simple. Because true innovation, innovation that changes the world, does not come from committees. It does not come from market research. It does not come from consensus. It comes from a singular, obsessive vision. The existing structure of Apple, with its competing divisions, its budgets, and its bureaucracy, could never have produced the iPhone. It would have been strangled in its crib. The Mac team would have protected its OS. The iPod team would have protected its music sales. To build the future, Jobs had to break his own company. He had to find a brilliant engineer like Scott Forstall who he could trust. He had to give him illegal authority to handpick a small elite team. And then he had to lock them in a building for 3 years and protect them from the real world. He had to build a pirate ship. The illegal hiring wasn't a crime of convenience. It was a crime of necessity. It was the only way to shield a fragile, revolutionary idea from the antibodies of the very corporation that was paying for it. The brilliant engineer, Scott Forstall, and his team of A players paid the price. They sacrificed their health, their time, and their relationships. In the 6 months after the demo, they worked 24/7 to actually fix the phone, to make the golden path the only path. They succeeded. When the iPhone shipped in June 2007, it was stable. It worked. Scott Forstall would go on to become the king of Apple's new iOS kingdom. He was the face of iPhone software for the next 5 years. But the pirate philosophy that built the iPhone would also lead to his end. After Steve Jobs died, Forstall, who had modeled himself after his mentor, found himself isolated. His combative, Jobs-like style no longer worked. After the disastrous launch of Apple Maps in 2012, he was unceremoniously fired. The brilliant engineer, the man who had been given illegal authority to build Apple's future, was now an exile. It was a final, tragic lesson. To be the chosen one of a man like Steve Jobs is to fly close to the sun. Scott Forstall was the man who helped him do it, and in the end, he was burned by the very fire he had helped create. That was the cost of the iPhone.